Guess what? Done changed around here. Have done changed. What do I mean? Look at this fancy thing over here. You see this? You know what that means? That means no more bitching. No more bitching. Keep bitching. You making too much noise. You keep banging things. Quit banging things. Guess what? It can't happen no more. Look at that. Look at that fancy setup we got over here. Hopefully you can hear me good. So yes, no more whining, no more bitching. Welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to get deep into literature. We haven't done a literary stream in a while. We did one with Mark Hackard and Tristana. And that was Dostoevsky a while back. And it was a lot of fun. But these literary streams don't get a lot of views. And that's interesting to me. I'm not sure why that would be. Can y'all hear me good? Yeah, we got a pop guard or whatever. Pop guard or everything possible over here in this contraption. It's a contraption, like some extension of Darth Vader's body. I don't even know. I mean, it's just a contraption over here. Look at this thing. Look at all this contraption over here. So shit's fancy now. No more whining. Complaints department just shut down. Right? We got a whole complaints department in there. Bunch of beautiful indigenous persons working hard. I had to let them go. Because we're not taking complaints no more. Things are professional around here. Things is professional. Do you know your literature? How come nobody's reading books anymore?
Oh, got a phone. Let me scroll my phone.
That's why. That's why nobody reads books. Because they're worshiping their little devil's eye they got in their pocket. Well, that's your loss. We still read books around here. I will never have a Kindle, son. I will never have a freaking... I don't even know what they are. What's the other one? Do those things even exist? I don't even know if people still have those. I would never touch one of those. Sounded like cooler in Spanish. We're about to get into some literature for the smart audience. You know, I read an article a while back my buddy sent me some years back. And I don't remember what it was. It was some study, right? Which when I hear, a study, like I immediately roll my eyes. But this actually was pretty legit. And it was making the argument that while it's certainly true that intelligent people of all stripes can gain insight, gain brain flex through reading a lot of different types of literature, a really complex literary work is unique because if you're following multiple stories, the paper argued, this actually lights up multiple areas of your brain. So you have the creative capacity going, you have like a temporal capacity going, keeping up with all these different storylines. And if it's something really deep like Dostoevsky or Flannery O'Connor that's using a lot of symbolism, then, I mean, her stories are different. Obviously, they're not like a grand epic stories like Dostoevsky, but they're very deep with symbolism. Anyway, the point is just that when you follow through a really big, in-depth story like that with multiple characters and multiple storylines, this is actually the best brain flex for you. The Bible is obviously similar, right? I mean, the Bible is a massive book of books, and it also, in a literary sense, functions in that same way, I would say. Right? Obviously, it's the penultimate of the stories. Excuse me, the ultimate of the stories, not the penultimate. It's the ultimate story. So it's the ultimate mythos, narrative that you could even... You couldn't come up with anything else even close, right? And in that way, it's going to achieve the same effect. And I always find that people who don't read literature, not that you have to, But the people that don't, something's always a little different with them. And I'm not knocking them. They just might be wired different to think or view things in a different way. But you need to be able to light up both of those hemispheres, the left side and the right side. Because if you're only on the left side, if it's all analytical, you are limiting yourself. If you're lighting up both sides, as really complex stories do, as I'm explaining, then all the more benefit for you as an individual, as a reader. And, I've been really enjoying Bayes Lit Analyzer's channel. And so, he's kind of got me thinking, hey, I got to do some more lit. He's putting out good stuff. So, like the work he's doing over there. And a lot of the books he's covering, I've not read a lot of those. So, several of them I've read, but not a lot of those I've not read. But when I went to grad school, well, undergrad and grad school, I did take a lot of lit classes, and my graduate work was literature and philosophy. So, one of my favorites is Southern Gothic. And so I thought we would break the mold of what we usually talk about with something new. And you're going to like Flannery OConnor if you're not familiar with her, because her works are in many ways fairly based. And although she was a Catholic, there's a lot that we can appreciate in her writing and her style, the depth, the symbolism. I mean, it's very mature writing. It's very heavy. And if you know anything about Southern Gothic, then you'll know that you're in for a treat, right? You're going to get comedy. You're going to get esoteric elements. You're going to get the grotesque. You're going to get demonic. You're going to get the bizarre. All of those things, as well as amazing prose, pop up in this unique genre. So if you're not familiar, this is people like Tennessee Williams, Flannery OConnor, Truman Capote, William Faulkner. I've read Faulkner as well. He's great for this genre. I think there's still a few grad papers that are up on the website where I did an analysis of one of the Faulkner stories, where these two characters are basically float down a river. There's a bunch of biblical symbolism in that piece as well. And I remember writing that around the time that I did Blood Meridian, and I wrote a long analysis. That, which is a lot of Gnosticism, by the way. Blood Meridian is not Southern Gothic, but it's, it's an American novel. Wise Blood is her first story, right? So if you don't know about Flannery OConnor, as we said, she was a Catholic, and she grew up in the South. And as a Catholic in the middle of the Bible Belt, right? This is always an odd situation, because the Bible Belt, for those that don't know, obviously I know it very well. I grew up in it. I'm in it. It's one of the greatest places if you're a literary person. Like if you're looking to write crazy stories, this is the place to be. So it's excellent for producing this kind of a person, right? And her short stories are typically comedic. They typically have this element that my professor really liked, that we were talking about, where the reader is mystified. You come away there's this point in every story where you're just completely mystified. You're thrown for, it's kind of like a Shyamalan's, Shyamalama Ding Dong twist before Shyamalan. But it's not just something like a cheesy twist. There's just these really bizarre, strange elements that pop up in the stories. And so she only wrote 2 short novels or novellas, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away. Tonight we're going to be talking about her first, which is Wise Blood, because I read the short stories years ago, and I thought it was great. So I thought, why don't I just go ahead and finally read Wise Blood, because I've heard so many good things about it. And then I found out there's a John Huston film, which is pretty faithful. I mean, it's pretty good in the sense that it follows the text, and Brad Dourif, who plays Grima Wormtongue, right? He plays the character of Hazel perfect, right? I mean, he's excellent. It's very well cast. Harry Dean Stanton shows up as the con man preacher, but I don't know. It's the weird 80s. It's a 1980 film, and it has this really ridiculous sort of whimsical music, which doesn't fit the film at all. So it's not perfect, but it's also not PC. So you're gonna have a lot of fun if you watch this movie. Because this is written again in the South in the 19. It says published in 1952, but I think she wrote it in like 49 or something like that. So if you do want to get deeper into her text, I do recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It's a window into the South. It's a window into a world that a lot of people find, fascinating if they've never been to the South, or if they weren't raised in the South. And amongst these short stories that she's got, I mean, there's a ton of them. There's about 500 pages worth of short stories. Some of the best, I would say. She's most famous for A Good Man Is Hard to Find, and it's a great story. And it also has this prophetic element, too, that I want to touch on. I'm not pressing that argument too hard, because certainly there have always been killers, right? We've had mass killers, or, quote, serial killers, for, I guess, forever. But the modern notion of the serial killer is not... It's sort of like partly a media creation, right? I mean, I'm not saying there aren't serial killers, but the idea that we have today of a serial killer after, Manson, even though he's not technically a serial killer, I know all that, but after Berkowitz and Dahmer and all these people, right? This idea of the killer who's killing, an Ed Gein, right? There was an Ed Gein back in those days, but we didn't have this idea like we do post, Silence of the Lambs or whatever, of the archetype of the serial killer. But she wrote in her most famous short story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, this character known as the Misfit. And the Misfit really, again, predates the modern idea of a serial killer in much the same way that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment really prefigures the psychology of the modern serial killer, as well as other people have noted too. So it's not just me, but I don't remember exactly what year Good Man's Hard to Find was written, but I think it was in the 40s or the 50s. So we're not into the era of this serial killer, so to speak, which is post Manson, even though Manson, oddly enough, is not technically a serial killer. But other odd ones that come up that you might find really interesting. Temple of the Holy Spirit is a really good, deep one. It's very bizarre. The Life You Save Might Be Your Own. Late Night Encounter with the Enemy. A Circle in the Fire. Those are really good. The first 10 or so, except for Enoch and the Gorilla, who, by the way, Enoch comes up in Wise Blood, if you didn't know. He's also the star of the short story there. Everything That Rises Must Converge. Very esoteric, bizarre one. Parker's Back. And Revelation. Those are all some of the short stories that I would recommend that I thought were really packed with a lot of symbolism. In fact, I think on either Revelation or Everything That Rises Must Converge, I wrote a grad paper, but I cannot find that paper. I do remember going into a lot of literary critics talking about how she was influenced by not just Thomism, but pretty strict Augustinianism and even perhaps traces of Jansenism. And that's typically plausible in the sphere of trad cats, right? Trad cats do have these tendencies, especially the SSPX circles. They do have a tendency towards Jansenism. And somebody was mentioning today on Twitter that, the trad cats want to have her canonized. It's like, what? Okay. I don't know that she live saintly. I don't know much about her personal life. I think she had medical issues as she got older, but just odd choices of canonization. But I guess in the post-Vatican II church, everybody can be canonized, right? So welcome everybody. If you would hit like and share, it's nice to have at least a few hundred people on what I hope is a high IQ literary stream. I don't know. It might not be. It might be super low IQ. It might be super slow boy. If you do want to support the stream, you can do so via the super chat function, which is through Streamlabs. I always like to have my educated audience with us and not our uneducated audience. I don't think there is any uneducated audience over on this side of things. I think we have a pretty ironed out bunch of sassy pants over here that know their stuff. All right, Wise Blood, let's get into it. So, if you've never been to the South, I mean, this is just, again, you're going to love this novel. This is, and I'm not going to ruin it for you because I'm going to, right, it is a novel, so we're only going to get through the first half. And then the part 2 will be for subscribers. And also for subscribers, too, I'll remind you that we're winding up this book as well. So that will be ready very soon, the part 2 for subscribers. If you're looking for the Milner Fabian text, that will be coming very soon. We had our live event in Nashville, which was a lot of fun. So that's why we were out of town for the last several days. So what's prophetic about this? Well, again, we've talked about prophetic literature. What's prophetic about Wise Blood? You know, we saw Dostoevsky's Demons, right? It predicts the mountain of 60 million skulls, which, again, how is literature being prophetic? This is a decade or two before Bolshevism really instantiates the decade, or the mountain of skulls. I mean, there could be a book somewhere that's prophetic in this way. We've talked about prophetic stuff, obviously, with predictive programming and sci-fi novels and dystopias, and we just did a walkthrough of Brave New World, as you guys know, very recently with Frank. We did the whole book, chapter by chapter. It was nice to review that. Oh, and we did do C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy as well some months back, so forgot that we have been doing some lit here and there. I forgot those. And I'm sure there's many, many other prophetic novels that we could think of, but this one I did not expect to see. The spirit of the new atheist in a late 40s, early 50s novel. Now, if you think about it, atheism in the 1940s and 50s was not that widespread. You had, a majority of America being, I think, basically Baptist Protestant. Then I think number 2 is Roman Catholic. And, prior to Vatican II, prior to the, mass drop in attendance and vocations and whatnot in the Roman Catholic Church, religious belief was not waning in the 1940s and 50s. You really only start to see this post-60s, post-60s countercultural revolution, fake countercultural revolution. You start to see this in the religious sphere as well, post-Vatican II, obviously, right? So then we start to notice a drop-off. But it's very prophetic that her bizarro Protestant characters that pretty much all sort of forsake their veneer of Protestantism, whatever they might have had, basically all end up as early versions of the new atheists, and particularly Hazel Motes. Now, Hazel's the key character. He's the protagonist of the story. And Hazel, we find out, is this young military recruit who had been injured in battle, and if I recall, I think it was his heart, which is, again, everything in her novels are going to be significant, including even the names are going to be significant. And Hazel is our main character, I think he's early 20s, I think. And he's been discharged because he got injured, but he did get a medal. But he doesn't want anybody to know that he has the medal because he doesn't want anyone to know where he was injured. And if I recall, the shrapnel was by his heart. So we're already noting that the damage that's been done to him is more than just his physical, right, appearance. There's something off with him. And this has damaged his heart, which means that if we're Orthodox, we could read this in Orthodox sense, right? His noose is jacked up, right? And perhaps in a way he doesn't have a heart, because this is going to be more or less kind of a tragedy on the part of Hazel. The other thing too is his name will consistently be referred to as Hayes, So he's in a haze, right? And as the novel progresses, he goes from bad to worse. But he's just been discharged, and immediately we find out that he has a very sort of pensive, like piercing, beady look about him, right? She talks about him like you can see his skull underneath his skin, plain and insistent. And if you've not seen the movie, Brad Dourif, again, who plays Grima Wormtongue, like he plays him perfectly. I mean, this is exactly what you think this guy is. Perfect casting, because this is exactly what you think he would look like. Let me pull him up for you if you've not seen him. I forgot to have this pulled up on the screen, but. And he's got that weird hat. Yeah, here we go. So if you've not seen him, right, here's Brad Dourif as Hazel. Perfect casting. And he's got this ridiculous hat, which is a preacher's hat, but like the preacher's hat from like Poltergeist 2. Remember, like everybody, there's nothing scary about the later Poltergeist except for that preacher in Poltergeist 2 who just looks, I mean, that's legitimately creepy, even still, right? This guy, right? With this, like, what in the hell denomination was sending out preachers wearing these, like, Undertaker outfits, right? It's like, why does a preacher look like the damn Undertaker, right? Remember Poltergeist 2, right? So it's funny because, man, maybe she's even playing on that with Hazel Motes, because there's this recurring situation where everybody that Hazel bumps into keeps referring to him as, you look like a preacher. I ain't no damn preacher, son. Get that through your head, right? And he gets furious. He goes into a rage at the mere reference to anything about Christ or anything religious. And so he's been discharged. We see him at his hometown, this little bitty, basically a ghost town, and that's significant because the ghost town is dead. He's dead. He's spiritually dead, and in that death will cling to him throughout the story. She says, when Hazel she being Flannery O'Connor, when he gets on the train, right, he goes to his hometown. It's a ghost town. His house is basically run down. His parents are dead, and he stays the night and sleeps on the floor in this old rundown shack. And there's a chifferobe, and he can't spell. He misspells it, right? He spells it as chifferobe, Shiffer, and he writes a note and he says, "If anyone touches this chifferobe, I will come and kill you. This is the property of Hazel Motes." And it's fascinating because throughout the story, the novel, we're mainly I'll mention the movie a little bit, but the novel, it specifically has the characters, this cavalcade of miscreants and rascals. They're all very attached to material objects, and that's to signify that they are essentially idolaters in the most extreme sense, right? And for Hazel, anything that he finds that's furniture or this book has dust all over it. It's making a nose itch. Or a room or a box, it fascinates him, and it also angers him because it makes him think back to coffins. So he's obsessed with grappling with the issue of seeing boxes and coffins. They trigger him. And we'll see this in a minute, but he's on a train when he leaves his rundown shack house and decides he's going to go to the next town a few towns over. It's called Talkingham. And he decides when he gets to Talkingham, he's going to do a few things. So he's sitting on this train, and this fat normie woman starts talking to him, and she says, "Well, I guess you're going to the town for your business. What's your business?" And he says, "I got business, and I ain't been redeemed." So he just starts talking to her about redemption, but he wants to convince her that she's not redeemed either. And it's weird because there's nothing to do with religious topics. He just launches into this with this random woman on the train, and he's doing atheist evangelism. He wants to convince her. He's not very good, right? It's not that logical because he's still kind of a dumb redneck, right? But he starts arguing with her to say, look, you ain't been redeemed because you ain't no different. And I ain't no different. And it doesn't matter. It makes no difference that nobody's been redeemed because there ain't no redemption. And he always makes the point that you're not any different than the person that isn't redeemed. And he's just obsessed with convincing random persons of this, right? This makes us, again, think of the odd motivations of the individuals that we see, like on YouTube, right? These weirdos obsessed with trying to convince people that there is no theism possible, the radical atheists. And again, anticipate, and all of those guys are really just sort of mimicking the Lawrence Krauss, Hitchens, Dawkins, Dennett, all of these characters, this cast of characters. And part of the issue with him is that we find out that he had a grandfather who was a preacher, and he resembles his granddad. And so there's people who recognize him. One of them recognizes, and they bring up this, you look like you might be a preacher. I ain't no preacher. Don't you ever say that again, right? And he's almost ready to fight people over this. And he's more and more becoming irrational, but at the same time, he's driven with this logic, right, eventually to create a church. So eventually he gets to the city, and within a couple chapters we notice that he's already been confronted with this fear of death. And even though he's an atheist, he has these weird inconsistent positions, like wondering if his mother's ghost will wander around and be mad if someone took her chifforobe. So that's why you put the note there on the chifforobe. So it's almost like he's haunted by his past, by his grandfather who was a preacher who sort of traumatized him, by this weird evangelical tent style preaching. But at the same time, he fears death, and he's afraid of death eventually catching up to him, which is why boxes trigger him, because he thinks of coffins when he sees them. So when he gets to the city, he decides that he's going to take his rebellion and his atheism seriously. And he says that, you know, a lot of people don't take this atheism seriously, but he's going to do it, and he's going to prove it. And so the first thing that he does is he finds this fat chick's number on a bathroom wall, and she's the local town prostitute. And he goes and visits. So he goes to see Lenora Watts, who is a plump woman cutting her toenails with a pair of scissors when he walks in. And he's immediately licking his lips, right? I mean, completely disgusting. But here's the funny thing is that you start to realize as you're reading this novel that no one in this story is virtuous or good. This is another odd element, is that we don't get any heroes in this novel. Everyone in this is an oddball, a rascal, a ragamuffin, a con man, a confidence man, or some form of busker, or selling some form of snake oil. Even to the point of when he's going to the various car lots to purchase his piece of junk car that he gets. So his second night in town, after he's had his intimacy times with Lenora Watts, he starts walking down the street, and we have the encounter with the first series of buskers. And the first series of buskers involves this guy who's selling potato peelers. And so everybody's gathered around this guy, and he's got this little contraption that peels your potatoes for you. And the main point of all this is just to point out the absurdity of, right, society in the sense of consumerism and all that. Yeah, that's true. But the blind man, the blind preacher, walks up, and he's also watching this scene, as well as another important character named Enoch Emery. Enoch from Enoch and the Gorilla, the other story, by the way. They're all gathered around this guy selling the potato peelers. And the potato peeler guy is a form of a con man at first, right? And what's interesting is that at no point, you might think Hazel's going to start catching on to this, and that he's going to be setting up a church to make money, to be a con man. And he's only really beginning to get the idea to start his own church, but he noticed that everybody's selling something. That's the point here, right? And so he sees the potato peeler guy selling the potato peelers, and he notices that he says, well, Jesus is just a tool, right? It's a tool for another type of market, another type of business. In fact, he'll meet another con man later who calls it the religious business, right? But this blind guy walks up, and the blind guy's asking for money and giving out tracts with his daughter, who is this like 16-year-old girl who's with him. And they're giving out these Protestant, Jesus saves tracts, repent, you're going to hell. And so a blind man, right, is leading this ridiculous 16-year-old girl who's also a character. They're all spiritually blind. That's the key here. So spiritual blindness is one of the key motifs of the entire story. And while they're out there arguing about this potato peeler, when the little girl, the 16-year-old, when she hands the Jesus Saves tract to Hazel Motes, he immediately rips it up, right? Because he's always enraged when he sees the name Jesus. And he says, there ain't no Jesus, because Jesus weren't no fact. And he says, you're all crazy, and I'm going to prove it to you, because I'm going to preach a new church. He says, my Jesus, as he leaned forward, there's a fool down there who's giving out tracts. So there's this, people start walking out, right, of this movie theater eventually after the potato peeler incident. And he says, I want to tell you something. Maybe you think you're not clean because you don't believe. Well, guess what? You're clean. Every one of you are clean. And let me tell you that if you think it's because of Jesus, you're wrong. I don't say he wasn't crucified, but I say he wasn't crucified for you. Listen here. I'm a preacher myself, and I preach the truth. So it begins as this ridiculous theological argumentation over potato peelers and tracts, like chick tracts, right? He gets into this stupid debate with this blind street preacher. This turns into a big theological debate. And so, but it's completely comedic because every element of this is absurd. Nobody is even coherent at all in what they're arguing or saying. The blind guy just says, well, Jesus is a fact because he's a fact, and you better repent because you're going to go to hellfire, son. And this causes Hazel to launch into this diatribe. He just goes wild, and he says, I am a preacher. Let me tell you the church that I preach. It's a new kind of church, he says. Am I blind? No, I ain't blind. He says, mine's the church of Jesus, not crucified. You ain't got nothing to believe in, so it don't cost you nothing to join my church. I ain't started it yet, but I'm about to. Right? And at the same time, there's this other idiot teenage guy named Enoch Emery, who's also a oddball character who has wandered into town. A lot of his characters who are the crazy characters are drifters and wanderers. Or excuse me, of her characters, Flannery's characters. And so Enoch is this almost slow boy, Enoch Emery, who believes that he has mystical insight. So it's a really weird situation because he's borderline retardo, but he believes that he has power in his blood, which makes him wise to understand the ways of the world. But really, Enoch is just a sort of a borderline, like, insane person, right? He's half crazy, but he's not so crazy that he can't, function and kind of like, feed himself and wander around the town. And he says he has a job working at the zoo, which we're not really sure that he really does, but he seems like he stands at the gate or something, like he just, watches people come into the zoo, and maybe he has this job, maybe he doesn't, but he's a character because for whatever reason he hates animals. And again, the juxtaposition of this contradiction of these weirdos that he hates animals, but he works at the zoo because I guess it's the only place that would give him a job. But he goes and basically just stands there all day making fun of the monkeys. and making fun of the animals. He hates the animals. And he says that the reason he hates the animals is that they all look at him with eyes of superiority. And they think they're better than him when animals are all ridiculous and he's better than them. And he's got wiser blood than they have. So, on the one hand, we think that wiser blood in Enoch's mind, which is the name of the novel, is a reference to, on the one hand, that men are more evolved, or they're superior apes, because all of these characters are basically have no religion, essentially. But oddly, we'll find out that they kind of do. In fact, they're more or less possessed / quasi-possessed. That will become evident as the novel progresses. And in fact, in Hazel's case, and maybe in some other situations as well, they're getting more possessed. So Enoch gives his background, and he points out that he had this terrible relationship with his father. And pretty much every character who is in this horrible mind frame has a terrible father relationship. And that's key, right? Because I think Flannery OConnor was perceptive enough to understand that a lot of our views of God are formed by our early archetypal interactions with our father, right? So our father, in a way, conditions how we're going to see God the Father. And that sometimes is something that people have to work through, right? It can be traumatic in that way. And most of the characters in this novel have terrible fathers, especially the character of Sabbath, right? Who is the 16-year-old daughter of the blind street preacher, who we find out isn't actually blind. He's a con man. So, what I love about this, just taking a little side road here, is that every one of these characters, like the way they view religion, is completely preposterous. There's nothing coherent about it at all. And yet, it's exactly what we see in so many people, not just in the Bible Belt in terms of superstitions and fundamentalism in the Bible Belt. Yes, that happens. But also in general, and the lampooning of the atheist religion that gets created in the novel. It is also just as absurd, just as evangelical, and just as fundamentalist. Because the very things that Hazel will mock in Asa, the con man, blind, the fake blind street preacher, it's going to be he's going to end up doing the same things. All of the worship of reason will lead Hazel to complete irrationality and self-destruction. That's what's crazy about it, right? And so when he begins to have this idea to street preach, he stands up on his piece of shit car that he bought for like $200. Or maybe it's even like 60. I don't remember. In the movie, I think it's 200, but in the novel, it's like he's haggling the guy down to 60. And that part's funny because he's like, well, this here's a piece of crap and it ain't going to drive nowheres. And then he whittles the guy down to like $60. And so then when he gets the car and it breaks down, he starts arguing with the mechanic of how awesome a car it is. He's like, that there's a car that will get you places. That there is a well-made car. It weren't made by no foreigners, right? So there's just this absurdity to this character, which, again, perfect for lampooning these sort of new atheist figures. I mean, it's just great. Literature has the ability to lampoon and pinpoint that is, a T-Jump. That is a Richard Dawkins. That is a, Daniel Dennett, whoever. These characters who are oblivious to their own absurdities, right? That's exactly what Hazel Motes is. So we find out that one of the things that really stuck out in Hazel's mind, and he seems to have this, I think he has a flashback, right? When he's sleeping, he talks to he goes back to the hooker that night after he does his street preaching. Now again, he's street preaching atheism. And he goes back to his fat hooker and he talks about this dream that he had, right? And he talks about how when he was a kid, the carnival came to town and there was a Peep Show and he didn't understand what it was. And he was fascinated by this. And he saw all the older men going into this Peep Show And so he snuck under there and gave the guy like a dime or something and snuck under the thing. And it was a woman basically wearing, I don't know, tassels on her nipples, and she was laying in a coffin in her panties, right? Something like this. Maybe she was nude. In the movie, it's tassels and panties, right? And he went in there and looked at her, and he didn't really understand it, but he knew it was naughty, right? And so when he leaves, he goes home, and this is when he's a kid, and his mom, who seems to be completely insane as well, right? The mom's mad because the dad was at the Peep Show, and she figures out that Hazel was at the Peep Show. And so it says, I'll read this interesting, the Christian imagery that pops up here is very fascinating. It says, his mother was standing by the wash pot in the yard looking at him when he got home. She wore black all the time. So again, death, mourning, etc. Her dresses got longer and longer, like were longer than other women. She was standing there looking at him. He moved behind a tree to get out of her view. There's constantly in the novel people looking at Hazel or looking at Enoch, and it triggers them. It makes them go insane. In fact, certain creatures, like there's an owl, and there's an owl with one eye, and he sees Hazel, and it freaks Hazel out because it makes him think it's the eye of God looking at him, and he goes into a rage, right? But it says that Hazel moved behind a tree to get out of her view. In a few minutes, he felt her watching him through the tree. He saw the lowered place and a casket again, and a thin woman in the casket, but she was too long for it. Her head stuck up at one end, and her knees were raised to make her fit inside the casket. She had a cross-shaped face, her hair pulled close to her head. He stood flat against the tree waiting, and she left, and the washpot came. She left the washpot and came with her stick. "What you seen?" she said. "What you seen? What you seen?" And so the tree, the cross are in his mind. She has a tree, the stick. She starts beating him with it. And she's whipping his legs, right, with the tree. She keeps emphasizing that it's the tree. This is like the cross to him, right? And as she's beating him, she says, "Jesus died to redeem you." And then finally Hazel says, as a kid, "Well, I ain't never asked him to." And so he gets this idea from youth imprinted upon him, this sort of bizarre Protestant form of flagellation, or so, like the flagellants of the Middle Ages, right? That he needs to pay off Jesus for these debts. And he hears about some story about monks or something, and he decides that he's going to fill his shoes with rocks as a kind of penance to pay off God. And so it says that he walked around with these rocks in his shoes, and he says that after doing it, nothing ever happened. But what's interesting is that the guilt is there because of the conscience, but the form of the religion that he's in lacks any power or lacks any healing to do anything. He never escapes the idea of it's just this sort of odd transaction. And then as he gets older, he realizes after he's been wounded in battle that, well, I'm not paying off anything. It's not doing anything. Then he decides that he's going to go get a car. And this is a very comedic section because he decides that the car is perfect because if he gets a car, he can live in it and he'll be completely free. He won't be bound by anything, right? And one of the reasons that he hates caskets is because he realizes that he's eventually going to be in one, right? So he's fleeing death. Death, as Paul says, right, is the enemy. And for those who are outside, Paul says, right, there is no hope. And I think, right, Hazel senses this. There is no hope. And that's what he's raging against. But he's actually raging against not just death, but his own conscience, right? By the way, if you want to support the stream as we cover Wise Blood by Flannery OConnor, you can do so via the Streamlabs function there. Streamlabs. Just do a super chat via Streamlabs. There is no Streamlabs anymore. I mean, excuse me, there is no monetization on the channel anymore since 2018. We don't make $5,000 a stream like some people said. So next he decides he's going to get this car, and the car will grant him this freedom. And he goes to this car salesman to haggle about the price of it, right? And there's a kid who apparently has Tourette's, right? This is really comedic because the kid with Tourette's just starts barking out all these ridiculous things. And eventually he says something like, "Sweet Jesus," or something like that. And this causes Hazel to go into a fit. And he eventually gets the car, which is, again, it's a complete piece of garbage. And it has no back seat, but he likes that because he thinks he can sleep in the back seat, right? So it's going to be his house on wheels. And there's a curious section when he gets the car and he starts driving away. It says the highway he was on, or he began going very fast on the highway, and it had filling stations and trailer camps and roadhouses. After a while, there were stretches where red gullies dropped off on either side of the road. Behind them were a field, and together were buttoned 666 posts. So that was a really curious. I mean, she obviously threw that in there on purpose. And so we're beginning to see the further descent of Hazel into possession, right? You'll notice not that you didn't believe me, but I don't think you can even see it, can you? Yeah, there you go. The 666 posts right there. And this is an odd sequence too, because he actually starts to dissociate almost, right? He pulls up to a hill and his car breaks down. This jalopy that he's bought breaks down, and it breaks down right in front of a rock that someone has painted, right, Jesus Saves on, right? So he sees this rock and he starts looking at it, and it says, "Woe to the blasphemer, woe to the whoremonger. Hell will swallow you up. Jesus saves." And he sort of just goes into this trance staring at it, and his car has stalled, right? Well, there's a trucker who's behind him waiting for him to move, and the trucker can't get around his car, and he gets out and walks up to him and says, "Are you ever going to get out of here? Turn this piece of junk on and get out of the way." He says, "Take your hand off me. I'm reading the sign." And the driver says, "Are you going to get out of the way or not?" Hazel says, "There's no person who is a whoremonger who wasn't something worse first than that. That ain't sin, nor is blasphemy a sin." The truck driver says, the truck driver just looks at him. Hazel says, "Jesus is a trick on black people." And the truck driver says, "Well, are you going to get your car out of the way or not?" Hazel says, "I didn't got to run for nothing because I don't believe in anything." Ironically, however, Hazel is on the run. The whole movie, excuse me, the whole novel, and in the whole movie, he's on the run. But what's he running from? He's running from his conscience. And he's running from death. But that's something that he will never escape. Next is the fascinating chapter where Enoch Emery becomes more of a focal point and a quasi-mystic. Enoch explains that his thought process is that he has wise blood, and his daddy had wise blood, and that wise blood has been given to him. And a person with wise blood, in other words, doesn't need Jesus's blood, you see. Well, what is wise blood? Well, as we said, a man is wiser than a monkey, right? They have blood, we have blood, but men have wise blood, right? The reasoning, because he's at the zoo and so forth, and he's mad about the existence of monkeys. He's just raging at the existence of the monkeys. But we find out that for Enoch, blood means something even more. It has this power in it. It's this mystical power. But he knows that religion has said that blood has power. But for him, it's not really anything coherent. He thinks that, oh, that means my blood's got power because my dad had this power, he says, by which he would know things. And he was supposed to just do things. And what it really is almost a kind of split personality or a kind of possession. He's mistaking what his blood is telling him to do for what is actually something demonic. And it even says at one point that he would at times think he saw a devil, and that this power of the blood, his blood, would convince him to do things he didn't really want to do. At one point he goes to watch a movie because his blood's telling him to do something that he has to do that he thinks is going to be something really bad, like, kill somebody or something, right? And at one point it says Enoch's brain was divided into two parts. Part of it was in communication with his blood, and it did the figuring, but it never said anything with words. So this is the sort of the demonic, right? The other part was stocked up with all kinds of words and phrases. While the first part was figuring out how to get Hazel Motes over to the frosty bottle at the zoo, the second part of him said, "Where'd you get this fine car? You ought to paint it something else on the side, like step inside, baby doll. I seen one with that on it, and then I seen another one." Right? So he's essentially a split personality, right? And really, all of the characters in this story are, in varying degrees, basically evil, right? There's not really anyone that's that good. And if you read Good Man Is Hard to Find, the first time I read it, I didn't really get what the point was. And then we read it again, and then we did a literary analysis with my professor. And he had a really good a point that his take was just that really the point of the story is that the grandmother's not good, and she's not any better than the misfit, the serial killer, right? Because the grandmother has this complete delusion about human beings, and she doesn't really see them as fallen. She sees them as innately, it's Pelagian, in other words. So again, remember, Flannery OConnor is most likely influenced by Augustinian theology, and so she's not a Calvinist, but she definitely critiques Pelagianism in that story, and actually explicitly in this story, right? Because one of the characters will, when he street preaches, this other guy, another con man shows up, and he's actually a straight up Pelagian. It's pretty funny. But Enoch really wants to team up, right? Everybody, ironically, wants to team up with Hazel. It's like all these con men, they keep wanting to team up with him. They want to have this scam going. They want to, partake in some kind of con or get some kind of thing going. And ironically, Hazel doesn't want any of this, right? He is basically a kind of completely committed atheist. And at one point, he even gets called the prophet, right, by the con man. The con man calls him the prophet and thinks we're gonna rope this into creating our own little church, and we'll make we'll make a killing at this. And it infuriates Hazel because he doesn't want any part of that. He's committed to proving atheism, and he does it for free. He doesn't want money. At one point, Enoch comes to him and says, blah, 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 I got to show you this. And Hazel out of nowhere screams, "I am clean." And it emphasizes, I am clean, right? So he's essentially saying, I am the I am, right? So whereas God is the I am, Hazel, again, blaspheming again, I am clean. I don't need it. And then in the next few pages, he says it again. And this is the section where there's an eye, quote, looking at him. I think this is the owl at the zoo, right? So he's walking around the zoo with Enoch. And there's an owl that says, Hazel becomes transfixed by the hoot owl. And he won't move. Enoch says, "That ain't nothing but some old damn hoot owl. You ain't seen them before?" "I am clean," he said to the eye, because the owl only has one eye. He said it the same way he said it to the woman at the frosty bottle. The eye of the owl shut softly and turned its face to the wall. So eyes trigger him because they make him think he's being watched and remind him of his guilt. They remind him of a divine eye of providence or an eye of omniscience watching him. There's a really comedic scene with the mummy, and this is interesting because Enoch gets it in his head that his blood has told him to go and find a mummy, and it's basically a midget that's been mummified, right? And it's in this museum. But because Enoch is kind of halfway slow boy, he doesn't really understand what it is. And he thinks it's this mystical object. And that if he gets this object for Enoch, Enoch will like him because he can use it in his church. So it's almost like he thinks it's kind of like an inverse of a relic, an atheist relic. Because the mummy perhaps would show, oh, Jesus is dead, something like this. I think that's the reasoning. And he thinks that this will be really useful to Hazel, who has said he's going to start the Church of Jesus Christ without Jesus. That's the name of his church, right? And so when they get over there to the mummy, he doesn't tell him what he's going to show. He's got, you got to come see this. You got to come see this. And they look over this glass box, which looks like a coffin, we read. And it's just this mummified midget in a box. Well, there's a woman who walks in, and she was somebody that they had been kind of spying on, who was at the pool. They were lusting after when she was bathing at the pool. She walks in, and unbeknownst to Hazel, who's once again transfixed in a sort of trance state, her face melds with his in the reflection on the glass, and she smiles, and it takes on this demonic appearance, and it freaks him out. Outside, they have a fight because Enoch says, I'll tell you where the teenage girl and the blind street preacher live, but you have to come see the mummy. He says, this mummy is ridiculous. You're basically a complete retard. And he takes a rock and bops him over the head. And I think the references to the animals that keep coming up is that these guys are beastly, right? They act like animals, right? They act upon instinct. And in that sense, the blood determines their actions, right? That might also be a way that we could read the way Enoch says that the blood tells him what to do. But it's always contrasted to the blood of redemption, right? I don't need that blood of Jesus. I got my blood. My blood is wise blood. Wise blood refers to those who are smart enough not to fall for the trick of Jesus, as Hazel calls it. Well, the next night he goes out to street preach again, to street preach atheism. Church of Christ? Ha! I preach the church without Christ. I'm a member and I'm a preacher, and that church is where the blind don't see and the lame don't walk, and what's dead stays that way. Ask me about that church, and I'll tell you about the church that the blood of Jesus don't have nothing to do with. Is he a preacher? One woman said. Let's get out of here. Listen, you people. I'm going to take you to the truth, and I'm going to take that truth wherever I go. I'm going to preach it, and I'll preach it to whoever will listen. I'm going to preach that there weren't no fall because there weren't nothing to fall from. There weren't no redemption because there weren't no fall, and no judgment because there wasn't the first two. Nothing matters but that Jesus lied. What church you go to? Mine is the church without Christ, lady. If there's no Christ, there's no reason to have this place to go to in the first place. Listen, if you don't get out in front of this show, I'm going to call the police. There's plenty of shows. Go preach in front of them. So he keeps getting booted out, right? Nobody's really listening to him, but what church is this? The crowd says. I preach the church without Christ. Is that Protestant? Or is that something foreign? Like the people don't get it, right? They don't get what he's after. Then the street preacher comes back, right? So the blind street preacher and his slutty daughter. We find out later on that she's actually not what she appears to be. They're actually con men as well, is the point. And they meet back up, and Hazel is after them because there's this weird connection between them. Because number one, he thinks he's got to disprove this blind preacher. The irony, of course, is that the blind preacher is a con man. And not only is he a con man, the daughter is also essentially a con woman, the teenage daughter. And it's so bad that the blind con man wants to pawn off his daughter to Hazel. And the daughter's fine with it because she doesn't want to be wandering around with this ridiculous father who's a con man. But the irony, of course, is that Hazel is basically the same or worse. And we find out the backstory of the preacher is that the blind man is that the evangelist promised that he would blind himself for an audience years back, and this was in the newspapers, and that if people came, they would be converted because they would see his devotion to Jesus by blinding himself. Well, this fascinates Hazel because if you remember, Hazel thought that the way that you are right with God is that you pay him off with a bunch of pain, right? And so he's mystified by this, and he figures out that he's got to disprove this preacher, but he's never even cognizant enough to figure out it's just a con man. And even the teenage girl mocks him at a certain point. She's like, I would have figured you'd figure out he's a con man. He's just a crook. But it infuriates Hazel because Hazel was prompted to disprove this preacher, this religious figure, who's he's totally ridiculous. And we find out, I think prelest is a good topic here because Hazel is obsessed with every night now coming out and preaching on top of his car, right? He stands up on this jalopy in front of the movie theaters, and his whole motivation was to do this to counteract the con man preacher who was handing out the tracts, right? So he wants to disprove this complete idiot who's a con man. And then it gets even better because then we get another character who's another con man that shows up. And this con man thinks that Hazel is a con man. And so he thinks, oh, we can work together and we can con a crowd. What Hazel needs is somebody to draw a crowd, and then we can get some money. And so he just assumes that Hazel wants him to be over there and right, to work with him. But not so. It turns out Hazel wants to actually convince everybody of atheism. He ends up in a huge fight with the con man because the con man, the new con man, right? The guy who says that he also was at one point a preacher, comes over and he says, listen, friends, I never had a friend. I got to read you his sermon. This is amazing because he gives this Pelagian sermon. It's wild. Yeah. So essentially now he's attracting more con men. And this guy says, friends, let me introduce myself. My name's Oni J. Holy. And I'm telling you that if you can you can check up and see that I ain't going to tell you no lie. I'm a preacher and I don't mind anybody that knows it. I wouldn't have believed it myself, but I'm going to tell you what you need to know in your hearts. You people come on up onto the edge. Push right up here. Let me tell you something good that you want to hear. I'm not selling anything. In fact, I'm giving everything away today. Friends, 2 months ago, I didn't know this man here. He's talking about Hazel, right? In fact, I didn't have a friend in the world. Do you know what it's like not having a friend? A loud voice from the crowd said, it ain't no worse than having a friend that would kill you. Why, friends, as I says, not to have a friend in the world is about as miserable and lonesome a thing that can be. And that's the way it was with me. I was ready to hang myself. Had despair completely. Not even my old dear mother loved me. And it weren't because I wasn't sweet inside. It was because I never knew how to make the natural sweetness inside me show forth. Every person that comes onto this earth, he says, is born sweet, full of love. A little child loves everybody, friends, and its nature is sweetness until something happens to it. Something happens, friends, and I don't need to tell no people like you. You can think for yourselves. As that little child gets a little bigger, its sweetness don't show so much. The cares and troubles of this world come to perplex it, and all its sweetness is driven out. Then it gets miserable and lonesome and sick, friends. It says, where's all my sweetness gone? Where's all the friends that once loved me? And all that time, that little beat-up rose of sweetness inside, not a petal dropped, and on the outside, it's just a mean lonesomeness. It may want to take its own life at one point. Perhaps yours, perhaps mine. Might come to despair, friends. That is of what I speak. and I know of what I speak, he said. But all this time, he says, all it needed was a little help and some friends. And then I met this prophet, he says. 2 months ago, I met this prophet, and he changed my life. This causes Hazel to rage because this is all made up. Hazel then speeds away from this event in his piece of crap car, and as he's trying to get away, the preacher con man jumps in the car and says, friend, you need me. We can work together. We can work these crowds. I'll bring the people, and we'll split the profits. Hazel says, I ain't doing this to make money. Get out of my car. I forgot to mention one other reference too. I was hesitant to talk about this part, but the teenage girl who we think is this sort of innocent character is actually not, right? She's actually terrible inside. She even refers to herself as filthy inside. And she wants to seduce, eventually, Hazel. And Hazel decides, I'm going to seduce her. And he wants to seduce the girl because he thinks that will show the preacher that he's committed to his atheism, right? But it turns out that he can't stand the girl. They actually don't like each other, right? And she starts to scare him because she acts weird, and he realizes that actually they were conning him, right? So basically, everybody in the novel so far has some angle on conning everybody, but most of the characters are too ridiculous to even know how to do it or to figure it out. The one con man who's actually pretty good thinks that Hazel is smart enough to be a con man, but then soon realizes, no, actually he's committed to this atheist gospel. We find out, as we said, Enoch is basically possessed because he goes in to watch 2 movies because he feels impelled. There's this blood is telling him to go do something terrible, and he doesn't want to listen to it. And he says, there's something happening today. Something mystical will happen today. But he's afraid it's going to be something bad. So he's completely superstitious. Again, split personality. He says that my blood's telling me to do something, and it's going to be something. It'll be something against the law. It's always something against the law. I ain't going to do it, he said. And so he decides he's going to go watch these ridiculous sci-fi movies. And there's a double feature. One of them, it says, the first picture was about a scientist called the Eye. So here we have the eye imagery popping back up. The scientists performed operations by remote control. You would wake up in the morning and you would find a slit in your chest and a head or a stomach or something that would then be gone. This is interesting because if you remember, Hazel had the shrapnel that hurt his chest. You would wake up and something would be gone and you couldn't do anything about it. Enoch pulled his hat down very low and his knees up in front of his face. And he looked at the screen. Only his eyes looked up at the screen. So he's basically scared by this ridiculous, B sci-fi movie. The picture lasted an hour before the next movie came on, and it was called Devil's Island Penitentiary. After a while, Enoch had to grip the 2 arms of his seat to keep from falling over the rail in front of him. The third picture was called Lonnie Comes Home. It was about a baboon named Lonnie who would rescue attractive children from inside a burning orphanage. Enoch kept hoping that the monkey would end up burnt in the orphanage fire, but he never even appeared to get hot, and this made him This made him furious. So, all of these colorful characters are just completely ridiculous, but that's again the Southern Gothic is replete with this, as we mentioned, the grotesque, right? So if you're wondering about the attempted seduction, that's part of the grotesque, right? Every Southern Gothic novel will have these, like Faulkner has in A Rose for Emily, the dead woman who's basically just been sitting in a bed for 20 years. She died in the bed, and they just kept Emily alive upstairs in the bed. That's part of this feature of literature. And the attempted seduction here on both parts here is really intended to signify that Hazel is more and more committing to being evil, and that he's raging against, right? his conscience, against divine providence, everything that would be directing him back from this treacherous path. So that's the first half of Wise Blood. If you want to watch the second half, we'll do the rest of that breakdown and what the ultimate significance of the story is. If you've not read it, I highly recommend reading it. It's an amazing piece of literature on, again, multiple levels. I want to remind you guys too that I might even do a stream. I don't know. Did you guys see all the alien crap that's out again today? Again, the Pentagon says that we have obtained record. I mean, just complete nonsense, right? So I might have to do an alien stream tomorrow. I don't know, just because maybe it's time to roll out the alien nonsense, right? I mean, it's almost like I couldn't believe they're actually saying this. Did you guys see this news story, right? I mean, this is such an obvious psyop and such obvious complete baloney. Ex-Pentagon whistleblower. The government is hiding alien tech, and it's all over everywhere. Pentagon whistleblower claims that the U.S. has UFO crash program. I mean, this is so dumb. So I might have to just do another stream on alien nonsense, because turns out that was all over the news today. But hopefully you enjoyed this breakdown. The symbolism is pretty sophisticated here. I mean, this is not, and this was actually her first novel. Maybe down the road we could do Violent Buried Away as well. But anyway, hope you liked Flannery OConnor. And let's see, we got a few super chats. If you want to support the show, again, guys, we need to read. We need to get into these kinds of wholesome activities. I mean, part of the reason the society is collapsing is that people are addicted to their stupid phones. And if you're spending more time on your phone than you are in a book, something's wrong. Now, I'm saying that to all of us, right? The one on the left, $2. How come nobody does a debate challenge to Jay, the Daba, the destroyer of all bad arguments? This is reminiscent of no car pages having memes questioning Toyota's reliability. Do people know that they will lose to debate you? Also, can you do a Dominican accent? I think there's a combination of reasons why it's difficult to set up debates. I think that at a certain point, debates require a degree of education that a lot of times the public just doesn't have. I'm not trying to say, oh, I'm super, super smart. No, there's plenty of people who could debate. Several of those people we've already done debates with. And if you think about, let's say like big name people, right? Atheists or whoever, the new Atheists, as this novel predicted. I mean, again, how amazing is this in terms of like the new atheist movement that we would see in the 2000s, right? Gaining popularity, gaining steam. That was a huge trend on YouTube for years, right? In the late 2000s, early 2010s. Remember the symphony of science songs that we made fun of, how ridiculous and just soy they are now looking back on them? All of this is predicted. I mean, that is, Hazel Motes is the archetype of this. And if you subscribe to Jay's analysis in part 2, in the next couple of days, we will do the breakdown of the rest of the story to see what the ultimate meaning of this and to what degree this was actually prophetic, right? Because I don't think that new atheism will lead you to a good place. And ironically, just as her novel is couched within the context of ridiculous sort of Protestantism, religion as a whole today has essentially gone the way of a lot of the kooks and the crackpots that we see in this novel. The con men, the ridiculous street preacher, the other con man, right? It's all commodified and a gimmick. There's no real authentic religion with power there. And that's what originally motivates Hazel, is this heretical version of Christianity. This heterodox version of Christianity that has traumatized him when he was young with his crazy tent preacher grandfather and his mom's bizarre, abusive, flagellant view of religion. Whatever kind of bizarre, maybe Puritan sect, we don't know. What better image? I mean, Hazel is essentially a symbol of American religion and the course of American religion and the trek that Americanist religion goes on. This path of the revolutionary faith of atheism. I mean, America is the revolutionary faith. I'm not saying everything about America is bad, but the bad parts of America are exemplified in Fire in the Minds of Men. What's the fire in the minds of men? It's Adam Weishaupt's fire that he fire worships. Okay, not in a Zoroastrian sense, but fire is symbolic of reason. And in the case of Hazel Motes, this reasoning faculty, this approaching of reasoning that he has to quasi-deify it, is all the more ridiculous because he's not actually a rational person. He actually surrenders his reasoning faculty and will do completely ridiculous things, self-destructive things, as we'll see in the second half of this analysis of this text. What does that mean? That means that if you lose the connection to the divine, reasoning really doesn't have a place and doesn't have any significance. Reasoning becomes irrational. Because what is reason? If we're nothing but wiser monkeys, if our wise blood is just a little wiser than a monkey's blood, that doesn't really mean anything. Reasoning is just another faculty of the body, like going to the bathroom. What is reasoning? It's essentially nothing. And so in the novel, creation itself torments and turns on the characters who are, for the most part, completely ridiculous and wicked people. Right? Whether it's Enoch, whether it's Hazel, whether it's the blind con man street preacher and the daughter. All these characters are complete rascals and completely absurd. And there's just so many layers to this because actually, yeah, the Bible Belt is in many ways like this. There's all kinds of ridiculous religious superstitions, absurdities. People believe ridiculous things. And it's ironic because a lot of the logic, right, behind people's approach to religion is completely superstitious. It's completely absurd. And then their reaction to that is just as extreme and absurd, especially in the case of Hazel Motes. It makes me think of the Nietzsche quote where he makes fun of the people who leave Christianity and become evangelical atheists. Nietzsche's pale-faced atheist that he makes fun of. That is Hazel Motes to a T. And it's a giant portion of, people aged 15 to 25 to maybe 30, 35. The pale-faced atheists on Reddit. Who now are like Hazel, mutilating themselves. Literally. The exaltation and worship of reasoning leading to self-destruction, mutilation, and the deconstructing of reasoning. This absurd God of the Enlightenment period. DFW dude, $10. Have a coffee on me. Thank you. Will do. PBF Live, $15. This is a great stream, homie. I love Flannery OConnor. Wise blood. Good man is hard to find. Everything that rises must converge. Yep. Good country people. Also a really good story. Yeah, all of the short stories are. I mean, some of them are better than others, but if you get this, yeah, I recommend that. Now, you can also get just the whole complete set in this really nice volume, which my mom gave me this as a present for Christmas a couple years ago, but you can't go wrong with Flannery O'Connor. I mean, it's just some of the best literature that you'll read. And for those of you that are into theology, right, you'll love the theological subtext everywhere. But I'm still kind of blown away at how prophetic Hazel Motes is for not just the new atheist movement, but where the journey of that worldview takes you. It's pretty crazy. But thank you so much for that, PBF Live. I want to remind you guys, too, that to support the show via not just subscribing and not just super chats, but if you want the part 2, again, that'll be in the next couple days by subscribing to jaysanalysis.com. Be sure and follow me on Twitter. It looks like Twitter is really going to be like where things are going. At least my videos are getting a lot more traction on Twitter, which that's how it is. That's how it is. I mean, I'll continue to YouTube, but I put up a video that got 10,000 views on YouTube and it got 5,000 views on Twitter. So if Twitter is going to be where it's at, then that's where it's at. Part 2 of this analysis will be, as I said, over Jay's analysis or on Rockfin. And support the show also by going to choq.com. That's choq.com. That is the show sponsor. And get a hold of some of that Shilajit for mental focus and clarity. You can't beat Shilajit for that. Choq has the best Shilajit that you can get. My favorite, as you guys know, is the Tonkat Ali. If you come to our live events, we usually give out these $15 bottles of the Tonkat Ali. Actually, I think it might be 30. This is actually a big, I think we give out the trial size, but great for boosting testosterone, peer-reviewed studies. Tonkat Ali, the Tonkat 100, I guarantee you that you will benefit if you check it out. There's also the Irish Moss for the ladies that want to balance out their hormones. There's the 7 Wonders that makes up for our mineral deficiencies. Well, Emmanuel sends $5 for me to get a Jalopy Essex. It is an Essex in the novel. That's for the Freedom Car. Exactly. I don't want to be bound by any laws and limitations. I'm going to get me a car I can live out the back of, and I'll be free. And Well, Emmanuel understands that. That's exactly what we're going to do over here. The mechanical Jacobin. Somebody I knew many years ago used to call it. Also, I'm going to do a 10-minute video on this. But I should probably do like a 10-minute breakdown of the absurdity of the alien nonsense, right? I mean, that's just obvious. We've done so many alien nonsense podcasts that it's almost like how many do you need to do? It's like at a certain point, it's like people are going to believe this if they want to believe it. So, yeah, head on over to choq.com, choq.com, and use the promo code J50 to get 50% off all of those supplements right now. You can also use the recurring subscription code of J53Life. That's J53LIFE. That will give you 53% off any recurring subscriptions, and I know that you're going to want those coming to you on the regular because they're great products. Also, head on over to Rockfin and subscribe to our Sister Moon Brother podcast. That is Grand Theft World with Richard Grove. Give them a follow and check out their Sunday night 7-hour podcast that they do, where they cover this week's news and the geopolitics that you need to know. So it's always a history course, more or less, when you watch Grand Theft World. And the best place to catch them is over on Rockfin. You can also catch me on Rockfin, as well as Jamie and her channel. We just uploaded Jamie's speech from the event this last weekend in Nashville. A lot of fun. Got to meet a lot of cool people, hang out with everybody. And even Chase Haggard showed up. Even the Haggards, believe it or not, had a representative at this insane event. All right. If you guys would hit like and share and subscribe over on the website. And I will see you guys very soon. I guess we're going to have to cover all this alien nonsense again because they just keep ramping up all this alien crap, man. It's so stupid. But yeah, subscribe for part 2. That'll be up in the next few days. And then part 2 of the latest writings